Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Midlands Network for Popular Culture's Inaugural Forum. We're going to jump straight in with our second event of the morning, which is our panel on new approaches to jazz studies. My name's Georgie, and I'm delighted to be here as one of the MNPC's treasurers to lead the panel today. So I'm just going to briefly introduce the outline of the event, and then we're going to get started. So all four of our panelists are from Birmingham City University, where they are involved in the university's Jazz Studies Research Cluster. So they're going to be discussing the field as well as how some of their work relates to new ways of looking and applying jazz studies in the 21st century. Just a brief note on the format, we're going to have the presentations in quick succession, so 10 minutes each roughly, and then about 20 minutes at the end for any questions. So please do post those in the Twitch chat or on Twitter with the Midspot 2020 hashtag, which we'll be keeping a track of throughout the event, obviously. And then at the end, we'll be going straight over to Jade Martin for our morning roundup before we break for lunch. Yes, so without further ado, I think we're going to jump straight in with our first speaker, who is Dr. Nicolas Pillai, who will be introducing us all to the broader field of contemporary jazz studies. Nicolas is a research fellow based in the School of Media at Birmingham City University. He is the co-lead of the university's Jazz Research Cluster and the editor of Jazz Research Journal. In 2017, he was awarded an AHRC ECR Research Leadership Fellowship. Jazz 625 Live, shown on BBC4 and based on his research, went on to win Best Music Programme at the UK Broadcast Awards 2020, and he is currently working on the collection Rethinking Miles Davis for Oxford University Press. So, Nicolas, if you want to go straight in with your presentation.
Sure thing. Thank you, Georgie. What I'd like to do in this first 10 minutes is give us a brief overview of the field of jazz studies. I'm expecting that most of you are not familiar with that field. You might be a little intimidated by the idea that you don't know anything about jazz music or its place in academia. Hopefully we can reassure you on that point. And as a first reassurance, I should probably tell you that in 2012, when I finished my PhD, I actually had no idea that there was such a thing as jazz studies. I had just completed a thesis at the University of Warwick in the Film and Television Studies Department on 1940s Hollywood cinema. So it wasn't really until I started looking around for possible book projects, and actually I'd been told I should get a book contract if I wanted to get a job. So I thought, well, maybe I could combine my interest in jazz music with my film and TV interests. And I didn't get the job, but I did get the book contract. So then I had to go away and write this book, which was Jazz as Visual Language. That was my first book, came out in 2017. But what that meant was that I started very quickly to realize that there was a whole sort of historiography and a whole discipline that I had to come to terms with. Very, very fortunately for me, it turned out that there were a group of jazz scholars in Birmingham. And so I started going to their meetings. This would have been, I suppose, around about 2013. And the Jazz Research Group in that iteration was held at the old Conservatoire building in Paradise Forum. And there were probably about 10 regular attendees. And that's swelled now so that we often have more than 30 people in our group. We usually meet in Parkside now. And the fact that the Conservatoire is now in a new building adjacent to us is very, very helpful. The group, in terms of makeup, is some members of staff, some PhD students, but we also have people who sit outside the university and outside academia, so music promoters, people who represent arts organisations, and we meet monthly. So it's a really useful way for us to share ideas, and I think the existence of this group was hugely helpful for me in sort of coming to terms with this discipline of jazz studies, which I wasn't especially familiar with, and getting that book finished. When I started going to this group, I sort of observed sort of two strands of jazz. I thought there's a kind of a music instruction happening at the conservatoire, and in some ways that followed a classical music model. It was based in canon. There were sort of landmark artists that students had to know about. And then there was another group, which was probably the group that I was more temperamentally close to, which was people who were sort of informed by cultural studies, who were looking at jazz, drawing on various disciplinary fields. And I think it'd be fair to say that probably that group was slightly more suspicious of canon in a sort of post Roland Barthes way. I think this dichotomy does exist in jazz studies. I think it's often quite crudely drawn. So it's sometimes seen as a practice versus theory binary, but I don't think that's actually true. And our speakers today, I think, are a good illustration of how things are a little bit more complex than that. I thought it might be useful just to sort of share with you a few brief things that I found out about jazz historiography as I was researching that book. I think it's often forgotten that jazz was, for much of the 20th century, a popular music. And so I was really pleased when Daniel approached me to form this panel. And the earliest kind of jazz writing was often writing by enthusiasts and fans. I've got a box of these things, but here's a pamphlet called Hot Jazz, which is full of stuff, things like discographies, appreciations. In the back, it's got this rather nice pen and ink drawing of Pete Johnson. And a publication like this would have been a small press publication. It was distributed to an organization called the Discographical Society. It's, I suppose, what we would call a fanzine now, but there is no real, I think, scholarship on this kind of fan literature that started off jazz studies. You do also get fans writing quite important histories which are still used today. Here's Jazz in Britain by David Bolton, which spends quite a lot of time saying why jazz isn't a popular music, because it's much more important, is what he's saying. And then in the 80s and 90s, we start to get academia taking notice of jazz. We're getting edited collections like Representing Jazz, which comes out Duke University Press, and starts to sort of begin a new jazz studies that's informed not necessarily by old-fashioned great man histories, but by a sort of more nuanced idea of what culture might be and what jazz's place within culture might be. Last year, the Routledge Companion to Jazz Studies came out. It's a pretty hefty tome, and that's got about 40 to 50 writers from across Europe and the US writing about jazz in all different ways. I think that there are still some limitations which jazz studies has to overcome, and as I've said, it's still quite a young medium. Quite a young discipline. When I go to jazz conferences, I'm often one of the very, very few brown people in the room, and there is certainly a way in which a sort of colonizing happens with jazz studies, and that's often something that jazz studies is loath to confront. There are also very few women in jazz studies and in the sort of practical courses in conservatoires, and this is something that I think needs some urgent attention in the years to come. I think as well that even though jazz studies has the benefit of an interdisciplinary approach, there's often a quite naive vision of what history might be, and some of those methodologies could do with a little more complexity. Which leads me on to my choice of speakers. The three speakers that you're going to hear today are recently graduated PhDs at BCU, members of the Jazz Research Group. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to ask these people to talk to you and to your network is that I think that they are perhaps the most convincing argument against that quite crude theory practice binary that I suggested people think about as being inherent to jazz studies. These are not just accomplished musicians, but also sophisticated scholars. And you'll see that while they have a variety of approaches, they do sort of convene around this idea of what jazz studies might be in the future. So I hope you enjoy the panel. I hope you have some questions for us at the end. And that's me for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolas. That was a really enjoyable talk and introduction. And I do now feel amply prepared for the panel. So with that said, I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Chris Mapp, who will be discussing extraterrestrial improvisation and free will. Chris is a bass player, improviser, and composer living in Birmingham. He uses sound, music, and electronics to satisfy his own curiosity, and in his work, written themes become points of departure, destinations, or fragments of group improvisation. So, Chris, if you want to commence, and I'll leave you to it.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks Nick as well. Nick's promoted me a little bit. I'm actually about to go into my third year of PhD study, so I haven't quite finished yet. One of the things I'm wrestling with in my PhD at the minute is this kind of balance between theory and practice. So I was trained as an undergraduate musician, I suppose, at the Conservatoire Jazz course many years ago. And since then, I've kind of found my way into the world of what's called free improvisation, which is often thought of as playing without any preparation with a group of musicians. So without a specific musical score, perhaps, or a specific musical idea. And one of the things in my practice is kind of challenging the model of what free improvisation is for me. And so I spend a lot of time thinking about where the freedom is in my practice and trying to find ways of explaining that to, in terms of my PhD and in terms of presenting my work as well. So there's the performance aspect of my work and also the theoretical aspect, and slowly one is kind of informing the other, and it's a nice conversation these days back and forwards between the two. Nick asked me to sort of talk a little bit about a presentation I did back in February to the Jazz Research Group, which was about a residency which a trio that I work with, that I run, I suppose, with the name Steelefel, did back in October. A brilliant little cafe in Sturchley called Artifact. Go there when you can, when the lockdown is over, I suppose. The residency was a 4-day residency. We played one set of music each day, and some really interesting things came out of that, out of talking to the other two musicians. So the other two musicians are Percy Persclove on trumpet and Tom Seminole Ford on guitar and myself on bass. And within that trio, we're kind of exploring ideas of freedom, using bits of pre-composed material, using past ideas and recontextualizing them in the present. So kind of playing with this idea of time and freedom. I'm going to try and share some images to give you a slightly better idea of what I'm talking about, hopefully. Here we go. So hopefully you can see that. I've probably got no way of knowing if you can't or not, actually, because I can't see the chat anymore. So hopefully you can see this. Here's hopefully some nice images of our residency, so you can see Tom and Percy there. As well as playing with this trio, I also perform solo gigs, and I did a solo gig back in December, and talking to one of the audience members afterwards, they described the music I was playing as sounding like the soundtrack to the film Arrival. I don't know if you've seen this film. I might just be about to spoil some of the plot for some of you, but hopefully not. In the film Arrival, which, here's the gig I did. In the film Arrival, it's based on the short story called The Story of Your Life by Ben Chang. Ben Chang, yeah. And he, in it, there's a protagonist, Louise, who is a linguistics professor, and she's brought in to communicate with a group of aliens. And by learning the alien language, here's the spoiler alert, she realizes that she actually has the ability to see through time. So it's through the learning of the language that she can see her past and see her future. And then the film is about the development of that. And it really got me thinking, because we have this issue with music where it's very difficult to describe in terms of language, written language, but we often talk about the language of music, the language of jazz in when we're referring to it. So what I started to think about was how the musical language of Stielerfeld was operating in order to kind of demonstrate how we're using, or how we are free within the framework we've created. So Stielerfeld, we've got a lovely album out here which you can buy, came out in March this year, is a trio. We use bits of composition. I'm always loath to call it composition, but I suppose it is, as ideas to kind of play with, as sort of past ideas. But in this residency, I tried something new. On the first 2 days of the residency, we recorded everything we played. And then in the third and the fourth days, I made the decision to play some of those recordings back in real time while we were performing. Quite randomly, as it happens, I used, I don't know if you're familiar, how familiar everyone is with music tech, but I used a program called Logic, which is mainly a recording sequencing software, not really designed for live performance, and to play back the samples that we recorded. And this meant I didn't have much control over what was coming out. It was, although I was choosing certain sections, it was actually fairly random as to the sounds that came out. And what I was interested in was how we then responded to those recordings as a trio. So the idea that playing things from the past in the present can create a kind of a future of improvisation, and our reaction to those recordings produced some of the most interesting music of the residency. And certainly when we were talking about it afterwards, that became a real highlight of the 4 days. And it's actually now altered the whole way that ensemble operates, using these extracts of the past. Some of the things I've been kind of reading about recently, thinking about this historical context, is ways of actually being free within the past. So quite often, free music or freely improvised music is described as being in the moment or spontaneous. And the more you think, the more you read, and the more you play, you start to realize that actually ignoring the past is a kind of a way of limiting freedom. And actually, by engaging with the past and recontextualizing some of our past ideas, and using them musically, we can start to make a narrative between the present and the past and alter some of those past events. And that's where I'm starting to look at where the freedom is in my practice. So when I'm talking about free improvisation, it doesn't necessarily mean free of limits. It doesn't necessarily mean you're free to do whatever you like, but a freedom within a set structure, within a framework. And for me, for this trio, that's Stielerfeld. So we use the bits and scraps that we collect together as kind of performers, bits of our past musical ideas, our past conversations, our past relationships with each other, the environmental aspects of each performance, and it all goes into creating this framework within which we are free to improvise. So it's a slightly different way of looking at free improvisation, a slightly different way of labeling perhaps what I'm doing. And it's also a kind of sideways step from perhaps what many people would think of and define as jazz. But the heart of kind of what jazz is for me is the improvisational qualities within it. And ignoring that is kind of something that I'm not interested in, although I thought I was interested in to start with. Such is the joy of studying for a PhD. So I guess that's it. It was kind of very short, informal thing today, but hopefully we'll have some questions about that. And I guess I'll hand back, and I'm not sure who's next.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, wow. So that was really interesting. I love the film Arrival, and I was wondering how that would be connected, but I can really see. Yeah, sorry, we'll come back to that in the Q&A. Yeah, that's really interesting. So thank you. So next up we have Joe. If you want to turn on your camera, Joe Wright, who's going to talk to us about improvisation within/without scenes. Joe is a saxophonist, maker, and researcher with an interest in experimental music, improvisation, inclusive music, and accessible music technology. And his research focuses on problems of agency and musical choice for young autistic children in inclusive child-led play. So, Joe, whenever you're ready, take the floor.
Thanks. Right, so hopefully you can see my presentation slides. So yeah, my name is Joe Wright, and I'm going to speak a bit about my research, but I'm actually going to focus more today on how doing my research into inclusive music with young autistic people has changed my relationship with my instrument and with the music I play. So I came into my PhD having worked both as a jazz musician and an improviser in more experimental contexts. And at that time, I was in a bit of a creative crisis, feeling caught between seemingly opposing sub-scenes of jazz and improvised music. So on the one hand, I was increasingly committed to a jazz group that's probably the closest thing I will get to pop in the kind of sense most people would understand it. A band that had a very kind of consistent music, very song-led, where the improvising is maybe focused more on supporting the song structure and less on, you know, going off on long solos as might be the case in other jazz groups I've been in the past. At the same time, I was also deeply invested in the London workshop scene, so a group of improvisers that arise from the highly process-driven improvising ensemble AMM, where the emphasis on the music is much more on process than product. So in one scene, I felt like I could be highly creative within the confines of a structure. And on the other hand, in this other workshop scene, those same structures were sort of seemingly diametrically opposed to the type of improvisation that went on there, one of searching for sounds and the responses that attach to them, as Karji puts it. Alongside that musical work, I have also been working in inclusive arts for many years, so making participatory child-led theatre, often involving a lot of music and dance. And all of this work that I've been involved in has been working with children and young people who are generally non-verbal and neurodiverse. And so the kind of combination of these backgrounds inspired my PhD work on the design of sound play instruments for non-verbal neurodiverse children. That work aimed to explore how instruments might be made that allow players to find sounds and music that interests them without being sort of guided or limited by social, contextual, genre constraints that tend to be put up by the neurotypical adults around them. And that work took a lot of inspiration from the inclusive theatre work I did, especially involving a lot of sort of artistic research methods, lots of child-led play, lots of what's called inclusive interaction, so copying, to put it very crudely. And now, with the benefit of a little hindsight, I'm starting to see that the challenges in this research mirrored those of my creative practice much more so than I realized at the time. So my PhD strove towards tools that would allow young people to find unmediated forms of expression through sound. And as a practitioner, I was struggling to come to terms with what I saw as conflicting pressures in different musical scenes, like a perceived pressure that I should specialize in one way of making music over another. And what I hadn't considered at the time was the impact that doing the research would have on my playing and my understanding of how and why I play. So I'll quickly go through two examples from the research, and then I'll talk about the sort of the way it's changed my thinking. So in these images you see here, these are from play sessions with a young person who I'll give the pseudonym Ben here. Early in my research, Ben had developed a really interesting way of playing these one-button sound cubes that I'd made, and in particular, he'd spent a lot of time rocking those instruments sort of upside down on their sensor, such that the weight of the instrument played itself, essentially. So he would rock the instrument and then sit back and watch them in this sort of interesting, active, then passive playing style. I later added a new feature to these instruments, and his playing style changed very drastically, having been consistent up until that point, where he then became much more concerned with manipulating the pitch of a looping sound file. And his playing style became much more active on a moment-by-moment basis. Alongside these interesting interaction styles of the same instrument, I'd also had the opportunity to play duets with Ben. And in our collaborations, we sort of communicated and collaborated very closely, but this musical togetherness was, for me, unusually complex and indirect, especially relative to some of the jazz stuff I'd done in the past. So to move on to a second example, I recently worked as a research collaborator and evaluator on a oily cart production called Jamboree. So Jamboree was a show developed as a sensory and participatory Balkan jam, co-produced with young neurodiverse people who often get labeled as having complex needs. I was involved mostly in the R&D phases of this work, where we worked with groups of young people to gather source material that then formed the making of the show. Because the show had initially been conceived as a Balkan jam, the musicians and the production team in the R&D stages had entered into the process with that genre as a lens through which they were seeing the contributions of the young people. And as such, a lot of the discussion and work we ended up doing in those early stages was focused around tuning in and learning to really listen to the contributions of the young people we were working with, that often maybe didn't fit with our preconceptions of what you would typically be doing within those genres. I don't have time to give full context to that because it's massively complex, but there's a really nice quote from Michael Bakken where he talks about adults' experiences playing in a ensemble led by young autistic children. And he talks about the adults having to be willing to go where the children take them, which is often to places where rhythmic grooves fall apart or fail to emerge, where growing musical momentum and direction suddenly disintegrate for no apparent reason, where they are asked to play things and to play in ways that define their common sense musical sensibilities, and where they must resist the urge to momentarily fix or change the direction of the group. And this last part about sort of fixing musical problems based on sort of musical habit and enculturation is a really big deal in this kind of inclusive musical work. So that's just a very brief overview of two contexts in that work, but I actually want to focus in on the impact these experiences had beyond their immediate research context, so for me and my playing. So to come back to Ben and his interactions with the instruments I built, his idiosyncratic playing styles were unwavering, really consistent, and really elegantly linked with the affordances of the instrument and the sounds it was producing. So his interaction style changed to match the nature of the sort of instrument sound pairings on offer, whether they were ones that could be manipulated directly in a sort of linear fashion, or those that instead create a kind of immersive world in which the player can indwell within a sort of responsive sonic environment. These differences chimed with the affordances of contrasting musical contexts I was grappling with myself as a player. And they allowed me to see my own approaches in those contexts in a new light, and especially to accept that I can retain not just one identity, but multiple identities that are part of my musical self, and which can bend or change depending on context. And then experiences such as those that I described in Jamboree, again, like Ben, many of the young people we met had really unique individual approaches to the musical jams we set up in the R&D sessions. These ideas or ways of making sound and music were often delivered with a great strength of conviction, and weren't always concerned with what we might have seen as convention or genre. But ultimately, they didn't negatively hinder the Bolton Jam project either, and served to open the ears and minds of the professional musicians in the group. So experiences like these have sort of inspired me to take on more adversarial or contrasting roles in jazz and improvised music with confidence, and attempting to frame positive contrasts and differences, sustaining these over longer timescales. In my research, I've come to be, I think, a better musician, and have come to understand my practice and relationship with the various sub-scenes I'm involved with better. In so doing, I'm better to play with or without the scenes I'm in, feeling less pressured by social convention, at least as I see it. So to wrap up, it might seem odd to see someone focusing on their own practice when talking about inclusive music research, but so often music for neurodiverse children and young people is framed in terms of educational or therapeutic benefits for them. And research in this area is no different. What I've tried to do in this short talk is flip the narrative and highlight the role of the young participants in inclusive musical practice and research as experts with unique ways of being and understanding the world, with perspectives that can be learned from. It's not a conclusion as such, but what I hope these observations might point towards is a different outlook from which future inclusive projects can be planned and framed on the basis of co-production and mutual benefit. And in this case, it's expanded, I think, my appreciation of jazz studies and my understanding of my practice. So thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you, Joe. That was really interesting, and I think some really important work as well. I thought it was really interesting how you picked up on those ideas of improvisation and collaboration, not only within music makers, but also in its sort of interdisciplinary applications, which I think is sort of a common thread that's developing. Maybe we can return to that in the Q&A. So thank you. But for now, let's move on to our last, but certainly not the least of our presenters, Corey Mwamba. If you wanted to, oh, yep, your camera's on already. So Corey is going to be talking to us about, with a presentation entitled Towards Freeness, Reflections on Radio and Improvised Music Participation in New Listeners. Corey presents an improvised music show on BBC Radio 3. He is also an improviser and composer who predominantly plays the vibraphone and dulcimer, and as a researcher he works across a wide range of jazz and contemporary music studies. So Corey, in your own time, take it away.
Hi, thanks very much. I hope everybody can hear me. My connection's been wobbly, so we'll see. Today, interestingly enough, I'm not going to dive about my research, my doctoral research, which is about the relationship between the performer, which was me, and the vibraphone in terms of and how that forms an instrument. But like Joe, the things that I've been doing outside of that have made me think about how I relate to the instrument as well. I'm going to talk about Freeness. Freeness, as Georgie said, is a show on BBC Radio 3, and it goes out every Saturday to Sunday at midnight. And the initial idea for it was started in August last year, in fact, almost to the week, so 20th of August, and Joby Waldman from Reduced Listening production company phoned me up whilst I was editing the PhD in a pub somewhere, and asked me about who could present this new program idea that they had in terms of new jazz. And I suggested people, and then he asked me, well, what about you? So I said, okay, I'll give it a go. On the 3rd of September, we recorded a demo, and on the 6th, I heard that the BBC had listened to the demo and wanted to meet and find out what I was like. I met with them on the 9th, and then on the 23rd of September at the London Jazz Festival launch, the programme was announced, and the along with me as the presenter. And on the 2nd of November, leading into the 3rd, and the 2nd of November happens to be my birthday, we had the first programme. The show in itself was not quite the show that the BBC had planned to have. Their initial idea was to have a show that focused on, say, the new jazz scene. So over the last 10 to 15 years, there have been articles in The Observer, Rolling Stone, The Guardian several times, some in the Times, of what's called the new UK jazz scene. So I'm thinking of people like Moses Boyd, you might have heard of, Nubia Garcia, Cassie Kinoshi, Shabaka Hutchings. And I think the BBC at the time were hoping to generate a show much like that. And what I presented them with instead, and I'm just going to share my screen for a second, so I hope you can see this. What I presented them was, this is something that I made from my research. I hope you can see this. So what I'm showing at the moment, this is something that along with a musician friend of mine called Tom Ward. He's a great woodwinds player and great writer of music. This, Joe was talking about scenes previously, and this is a very, very incomplete snapshot of jazz and improvising musicians in Britain and Ireland who are working right now. You can see at the top there, maybe it says 1,400 people. You can zoom in and you can see all these names. And the rationale that I used was that if you filtered the bands in terms of London over the last, say, 10 years, so starting from 2010, for example, what you end up with is 47 bands out of 1,400 people. And the question I put to the BBC was, do you want to represent these 47 people, or do you want to represent improvised music? And the answer was, we want to represent improvised music. So we were able to shift the emphasis of the show in terms of talking about improvised music, and it's worth thinking about what we mean by improvised music in this sense. In a way, as Chris said, there's ideas in terms of freedom, in terms of thinking about in terms of spontaneity or preparation, but I think what solidifies it for me, solidifies improvised music, is that it's methodological. So you find improvising, which is just a form of music making, really, in all sorts of contexts, and it's methodological. It sometimes gets conflated into a genre. So a lot of people say, when you talk about improvising, you're talking about jazz, but Turntabling has improvising. Music of the European medieval period from the 1000s up to the 1300s had improvising, and in fact there was quite a lot of improvising in European music. Quite a lot of African musics utilize what we call improvising. as a method of making music. So conceptually, it was about saying this isn't a genre show, but a methodological show. And that enabled us to say, right, who do we want on this show? Do we want just a limited set of people who are privileged into the positions they are by who, you know, whether they're written about, whether they have record deals, you know, do they have the money to do so? Or do we want to talk about improvised music? And the decision was made that we were going to talk about improvised music. When we announced that anybody of whatever status could send music in, there was a really big flurry of emails into the Freeness account. And a large proportion of those at the beginning came from labels and agents. But an increasing number came from people who just said, well, I'm improvising at home. What about this? And that certainly increased over lockdown. The crucial thing in this is that the producer and I, a work producer called Rebecca Gaskell, we ended up playing them. And that encouraged more people to listen to them. And the more we played, the more emails we seemed to get. So we receive something in the region of 30 to 80 emails asking us to play music. And in a typical day, around about 30 to 40% of those is actually from people who aren't signed to a label, wouldn't class themselves as professional musicians, so to speak, and actually come from many regions of the world, including emails from Sri Lanka, from Zambia, which is where my parents are from, which is quite nice, as well as those from the United States and from the UK. So in terms of thinking about the relationship with improvised music, and how popular it is, and there's an idea within jazz and improvised music that it isn't popular now, but actually doing improvising is quite popular. And one of the things I want to kind of explore much more is how the process of radio making has encouraged people to send in more music, to engage with improvising as a practice. The tracks that we've played, tracks from 10-year-olds and from 90-year-olds, and so it's quite intergenerational as well. And one of the kind of indicators for seeing how popular it is through the Radio Joint Audience Research records, and they check every quarter to see the number of listeners, and we had 45,000 listeners, which is kind of on a par with Late Junction, which is a show you actually might have heard of, and I think that the listening figures and the volume of emails we get show that there is actually a much kind of stronger engagement with music making and improvised music making than we actually give ourselves credit for. So that initial image that I showed of the rhizome of 1,400 people is much bigger than we think. It kind of shows that improvising and practice and improvised music is actually really everywhere, and not just limited within the confines of what we think of as jazz studies. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Corey. Yeah, that was really interesting. I really liked what you were talking about how improvisation has itself become a sort of a popularity, especially over the lockdown, which I think is something that we can all relate to. But yes, so thank you for that presentation. We're just coming up to about 12:30, which is perfect timing. So we've got about 15 minutes now for any questions. Thank you, all of you, for joining us here today. I've really loved chairing this panel and hearing about all of your work and your research. We do have more questions in the chat, but as I said, sadly, we don't have time. But we have posted the Twitter links for all of our panelists. So if you have any questions that we haven't been able to have time to answer, please do get in touch with them. I'm sure they would love to have conversations elsewhere and beyond this event. But for now, I will do the applause that we would usually have at this point, which we sadly can't today. But yes, thank you again, everyone, for joining us.